Julian Goldman, presenting quantum clinical scenario number 3, home to hospital, or the use of telehealth devices. Home monitoring, especially discharge from the hospital. Add a bit more background. Typically, the data from a telehealth device is monitored by a remote monitoring service of some type, an intermediate service that then reports data to the hospital. Or it's possible that the hospital staff themselves are monitoring the patient at home. It's a somewhat specialized paradigm today. The data from the patient's device, let's say, for example, the blood pressure monitor, is transmitted to another device. That other device might be a mobile phone or a set-top box or some other wireless device in the home that may be connected to the phone line or through the cell phone system to transmit the data. The patient's identity, their name or other identifying number, is typically attached to the data stream by that intermediate device. Therefore, if one were to use telehealth devices outside the home and not in with the architecture that they were designed for example, if one were to pick up the patient at home and bring them to the hospital, the appliance that normally attaches their identity to the device data would remain at home and would no longer travel with the patient. That poses an interesting problem for the use of telehealth devices in other environments. And there are other challenges as well. If the patient is wearing a telehealth device, that device typically does not have a clinical alarm. So, for example, in comparison, a patient who's in the hospital wearing a pulse oximeter for continuous monitoring of blood oxygen level or a blood pressure monitor uh, would normally be monitored by those devices, and the vigilance would be enhanced because if the blood pressure dropped or if the oxygen saturation dropped, there would be an alarm that would be enunciated at the device itself, and typically remotely as well, perhaps at the nursing station, so that the staff would know to attend to the patient if they had a problem. But telehealth devices typically don't have alarms because they're not designed for that purpose. So if we wanted to use telehealth devices in the hospital or in a high acuity environment, how would we add that alarm capability? Well, presumably through some type of middleware solution. We also would have to transfer the data into a more permanent record, such as the EHR or EMR. And if we did that, we would want to tag the data as being sourced from telehealth devices. We would need to know the provenance of the data because it's quite possible that the accuracy or the performance of the lower cost telehealth device might not be comparable to the hospital grade device, or it might be. This is an unanswered question at this point in terms of performance uh, parameters of some of these devices, especially in patients that begin to decompensate. But by tagging the data appropriately, we could understand it within that context. And over time, we'll better understand the capabilities of telehealth devices for to manage the continuum of care of a patient um, through different acuity settings. Let's dive into the clinical scenario that we developed to better understand the strengths and limitations of the current technology and its implementations, as well as to design more complete interoperable solutions to enable the transition of care through continuous monitoring. So in this scenario, we have a 68-year-old man who has a history of hypertension, congestive heart failure, and insulin-dependent diabetes, who also has a wearable insulin pump to manage his diabetes and a continuous glucose monitor. The patient uh, had developed pneumonia, for which he was hospitalized and treated with intravenous antibiotics in the hospital. And due to the illness, his congestive heart failure worsened, he decompensated, and that had to be treated. And his blood glucose level became difficult to manage, which is not atypical when a patient has an infection. After 4 days of hospitalization with intravenous antibiotic administration, the patient was discharged home on oral antibiotics, And the patient lives alone, so a visiting nurse was scheduled to see him. At home, the patient received a complete telehealth monitoring kit. That is, he received a 3-lead electrocardiogram for cardiac rate and rhythm monitoring, a wearable blood pressure monitor, and also a weight scale to help monitor any weight changes, especially associated with congestive heart failure exacerbations. A remote disease monitoring service was used to help keep an eye on his health status and report that information to his care team. After the patient was home for a day, he realized that he was running low on blood pressure medicine. And although he could have asked his visiting nurse to refill the prescription, he didn't realize that. And so he decided that he felt well enough to walk down to the street corner to fill his prescription. Unfortunately, along the way, he became dizzy, and he was found lying in the street, confused and minimally responsive. And he left the house without his wallet, without his ID, and he was scooped up by the ambulance and to be brought to the hospital for treatment. In the ambulance, uh, and we are describing the future state where we believe telehealth devices will go, and where we hope to help enable these capabilities. Um, these devices that are already on the patient will be used to monitor the patient in the ambulance en route to the hospital. That is, instead of removing the patient's blood pressure monitor and electrocardiogram, uh, these devices will have their data interrogated in the ambulance, which will provide two capabilities. Number one, the capability to continuously monitor the patient with devices that are already in place. And number two, the ability to read the data stored in the device. And that could include the patient ID so that the hospital could be prepared to look up the patient's information, and also the recent history, which could help explain what happened to the patient and why this patient fell in the street and what caused the problem. Was it due to low blood pressure, low blood glucose, some other problem? In addition to that, access to the remote disease monitoring service data could be obtained in order to determine the patient's status at home. For example, have they gained a significant amount of weight in the last day, which would indicate that the congestive heart failure is worsening. And then, as the patient arrives at the hospital, the same medical devices that were in place on the patient would remain in place and continue to be used at least during the initial assessment and triage of the patient. However, as discussed previously, because the devices don't have alarm capability, that capability would be implemented through a middleware through the ICE, through the integrated clinical environment that would provide that functionality. It would provide handshaking with the devices, heartbeat device detection of the devices to assure they're connected, and provide alarm capability for clinical alarms. In addition, the integrated clinical environment capability would include the means to adjust the programming of the wearable insulin pump in order to treat the patient on arrival in the hospital. So that's the a high-level description of quantum clinical scenario number 3, the use of telehealth devices for high acuity care in transport and in the hospital. What are some of the technical innovations that have to be addressed in order to implement this scenario? Well, there's the hospital grade type connectivity of telehealth devices. That is the use of these devices for higher acuity care, whether that's in the hospital or in an ambulance or in other environments. There's the implementation of the alarms from the devices, which are essentially functioning as thin sensors. They don't have the full capabilities of typical hospital medical devices, and so some of those capabilities will have to be provided by other elements of the integrated clinical environment. In addition, uh, the, the need to use the telehealth device data for real-time patient management drives certain other technology needs, such as the ability to manage the data provenance, the patient ID, and also the assurance of the synchronization of the clock times from these various monitors. And as they might be lower cost monitors with lower priced clocks and without uh, cell or GPS connectivity, it's quite likely that their clock time will drift. And yet one needs to align that data in order to have an accurate data record for management of the patient. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions or would like more information about the work, please visit our website, www.mdpnp.org.